Welcome to the first session of the Asking Different Questions research training series. My name is Sarah McCullough, and I'm the Associate Director at the Feminist Research Institute. This is a project that has been a long time coming and something that is also funded by a National Science Foundation Innovations in Graduate Education grant. This is part of a program run out of the UC Davis Feminist Research Institute, where we are building more just futures through leadership, inquiry, and collaboration. One way I like to think about the work we do is we support research that puts our values into action, whether that's a value for gender justice, racial justice, generally creating a world where we can all live full lives. And part of that work is the Asking Different Questions program. And what the Asking Different Questions program is doing is it is introducing key insights from feminist science and technology studies, critical race theories, and more broadly, humanities and social sciences, so that STEM scholars can apply this work to their own research context and have more of a foundation for dialogue and collaboration with scholars from these more radically different disciplines. Particularly in the field of science studies, one way to put it is we've been studying researchers for a long time, and it's time for more dialogue. And that's part of what this is about. The agenda for today, and if you continue to come to these sessions, this will be you'll notice a theme. We'll start off by introducing some foundational concepts, and these are all concepts that have a rich body of literature behind them. Then you'll have an introduction to the topic we'll be discussing for the day. We will present you with a case study or some other material that will give you something to mull over. And then some of you are going to take part in discussions, whether discussions as part of the Asking Different Questions communities and labs. And I'll be suggesting some ways to do those, to take part in those discussions, and finally offer some closing thoughts. So today's foundational concepts. The first I want to introduce is settler colonialism. Settler colonialism describes a distinct form of colonization that we have in the US. The colonizers in the US didn't come simply for resource extraction, as was the case in other sites. Well, much more than that, but the colonizers here came to stay. Therefore, that involved possession of land and the erasure of indigenous people and their culture. Today, there's this sort of imaginary that indigenous communities are a thing of the past, not necessarily active actors today. And settler colonialism suggests that this isn't a coincidence. This is actually crucial to the formation of a settler colony state. And as we'll see today, when indigenous communities act in a way that demonstrates their autonomy and their active presence, it can be highly disruptive to those in power. The second concept that I want to introduce today is indigenous science. And one way to think about this concept is as a way that indigenous communities produce knowledge. A knowledge that is rigorous, that is detailed, that is based on observation and analysis of a reality. I think one key difference that we often see between indigenous science and what we could call like Western or traditional science, traditional from our perspective, I should say my perspective, is that science, as we often talk about it, is geared towards finding the truth, sort of finding like an outcome. It's whereas many lines of indigenous science think more around questions of relation and process, like how do we live in right relation. I also want to highlight that indigenous science is far from just one thing. It varies, it will change, just as there are many different indigenous communities. I bring up these topics today not necessarily to educate you about them in depth, but more to gesture towards the vast body of research that underlies what we're talking about today. So if this is something that interests you, these are sort of like some keywords that you can look towards to learn more. So now I'm going to turn to the specific case study that we're going to talk about today, to think about these concepts, think about the way that politics, in this case also long histories, continue to influence science today. Many of you, particularly any that are in the, if any of you are in the astronomy world, I'm sure you have heard about the controversy around Mauna Kea and the 30-meter telescope. I'll provide a really quick overview to kind of set the stage for a piece that we'll talk about more in depth. Mauna Kea is the highest point on the Hawaiian Islands, on the Big Island, and it is also a sacred place for Native Hawaiians. And this is sacred for a people. It's important to say whose lands were taken in an overthrow of their monarchy, who continue to be disproportionately under-resourced on the lands where they have long lived. The summit of Mauna Kea is also ideal for astronomy because of its atmospheric conditions. There are already 13 telescopes on the summit, and the 30-meter telescope would promise to be the biggest, the one that is capable of giving us new insights into the histories of the galaxy, planets formation, really providing new data to help us understand some real fundamental questions around astronomy in the universe. Its planned construction has ignited some real controversies between astronomers and the broader scientific communities and Native Hawaiians. A group led by Native Hawaiians calling themselves the Protectors of Mauna Kea have prevented the construction of this telescope through both legal means and through active nonviolent protest. They have been subject to arrest, and it has really highlighted, their work has highlighted how the scientific presence on the summit relies upon this history of colonialism, that these scientists would not be there without the support of the state that did take the lands from these people. And so the core issue here is a question of power and land. Do Indigenous people have a right to decide what happens on their land? It raises these questions of ongoing consent. In some of the stories around Mauna Kea, the scientific community has posited that long ago, the Native community did welcome them, and therefore they continue to be welcome. That's a story that has been challenged by many of the protectors. So how can Native Hawaiians be leaders in making the decisions about the land and the impacts that it has on their community? So now I'm going to transition to reading a bit from a very specific piece. This is a piece on Medium written by Aurora Kagawa Viviana, and they are a Native Hawaiian scientist. And I'm just going to go ahead and read some excerpts. If you are able to access this piece and you want to follow along, know that I will be jumping around a little bit too, just for time's sake. Mauna Kea, redirecting the lens onto the culture of mainstream science. Now I'm speaking in her voice. I am a Hawaiian scientist who believes the 30-meter telescope does not belong on Mauna Kea. For me, however, the conflict over the future of the mountain summit, long assumed to be plum territory for astronomy, is a battle for the soul of mainstream science. I am trained in environmental engineering, botany, and geography, and spent the last 20 years of my life immersed in some form of STEM-related research, education, or advocacy. Although I am neither a physicist nor an astronomer, I appreciate that new and groundbreaking tools can enable access to new kinds of data, insights, and opportunities. Yet I'm also an advocate for a practice of science that is just and equitable, that considers historical context, power dynamics, diverse sets of stakeholders, and the costs and trade-offs of any given research agenda. I'm skipping ahead a bit now. In 2015, I was a preoccupied Hawaiian graduate student at University of Hawaii Manoa, and the rapid strengthening of the movement to stop 30-meter telescope construction caught me by surprise. I was awed and humbled that the seemingly inevitable construction project on this beautiful Mauna could be halted through the collective action of people who believed in a particular future for the mountain and who worked in a disciplined advocacy through a very organic movement. The movement showed me that collective commitment centered in caring deeply for something, aloha in its truest sense, can indeed transform people, narratives, and trajectories of history. It gave me hope. Could we not draw upon the same kind of collective action, grounded in true aloha, to confront global scale challenges like climate breakdown? I began to question whether I wanted to continue to be part of the sciences at University of Hawaii Manoa. I no longer had the heart to recruit students to STEM fields. This was incredibly difficult because over the previous decade, I had formed my identity around being a champion of STEM. The framing of the 30-meter telescope conflict in public and science circles was the most painful part of it all. Even now, Hawaiian versus science, science versus religion, culture versus science, progress versus Stone Age, and other permutations of this trope continue to be paraded around. These statements that equate science to progress and upholding cultural values as backwards are experienced by many Hawaiians, myself included, as not only incorrect, but also dehumanizing. They caricature the traditional culture and Hawaiian people while providing no critical examination of the nature of what we call science. In 2015, it became clear that the 30-meter telescope movement unnerved those who were accustomed to having unchallenged authority in decision-making in the University of Hawaii system, including those who had assumed a 30-meter telescope was green-lighted long ago. It seemed especially problematic for those who preferred the astronomy that astronomy maintain its historical privilege of relatively unfettered access to the mountain summits of the Hawaiian Islands. Although scientific norms dictate that advancement is made through critique, challenge, and incremental change, 2015 reminded me that within the sciences, the only meaningful critique can come from scientific insiders, those identified by a specific science community as one of their own. All else, it seemed, is perceived as an attack on science, an attack on reason and objectivity, requiring a defense of science. Mauna Kea represents a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I continue to experience this as a fight for the heart and soul of mainstream science. A growing number of scientists are beginning to ask, how do we do science? Where do we draw the lines of what is appropriate research? How do we balance trade-offs, and whose trade-offs count? What if we were more conscious of our tendency to write blank checks for ideas of professional science progress and advancement in its frontier mentality engine? To me, practices of science in its present form smells a lot like American manifest destiny associated with terrible loss for so many Indigenous communities. And yet, I remain dedicated to science, to the curiosity and joy of learning how the world works in all of its complexity. I often question whether our current institution and individuals who are part of them are capable of humble introspection and change. Yet I believe that for us to move forward, for us to de-escalate the current conflict over Mauna Kea, what must change is how we do science. So how do we achieve this change? I know this issue is complex, and I do not think a single solution will resolve the issues surrounding 30-meter telescope. It troubles me deeply to watch what ends the state is willing to go to push its agenda. I'm troubled by the simultaneous tokenizing across the University of Hawaii system of Hawaiians and Hawaiian culture for performances of cultural sensitivity and consultation laced with appropriation that wins big funding, which University of Hawaii uses for branding, while there is this backhanded institutional attitude towards Hawaiian descent. It triggers sensations of cognitive dissonance, a kind of institutional gaslighting. Skipping ahead a bit. How might we instead raise critical thinkers in science and engineering who can boldly reimagine who and what science and engineering are for? Can we begin to create spaces to interrogate the historical and current inequities and ways STEM training has been and is deployed for incredible advances in human health and understanding, as well as for purposes of dispossession? It's hard not to be deeply cynical by the frustration that Mauna Kea dredges up. I am angry, but I believe that we can and must do better. I imagine the future can be different. Where do we go from here? Let's get creative. Let's envision a more equitable future between our current dismal state. This is possible, but we need to be bold, take some risks, learn from Kiai. We need to be willing to imagine and commit to the futures and principles we will stand up for. I'm going to pause there, and I want to offer a sort of a further conclusion than you get in this piece that this author and others presented in January 2020 in a paper that calls for a halt to the construction and the beginning of a deeper process of dialogue with Native Hawaiians as equals in that discussion of what should happen around the 30-meter telescope. Really crucial, the authors said that this discussion needed to be open to the possibility of not building the telescope there, of relocation to another location, while also being open to the possibility that it could stay there. But crucial to it, and I found this really interesting, they offer they hold on to informed consent and try and propose a cultural institutional review board process that would be akin to what we currently do, an individual IRB process, but for more of a cultural perspective. You could say more of a communal perspective. And they offer a lot of other really interesting solutions going forward in that paper. This is just kind of like a peek into a very big, very long controversy that a lot of people are still talking about, that is still very active, that is a controversy that we at the UC system are complicit in, as UC is one of the supporters of the 30-meter telescope and contributors. So now I invite us to turn to a discussion. In these discussion questions that I'll be offering, and again, we will not be doing a discussion right now. This is something I invite you to do with your smaller research communities. The first part of the discussion questions I offer will always be more around the content of the materials. The first question, why does the author argue that it is important to look at the history of science? 2, the author critiques the defense of science reaction. Why? And there we get at questions of expertise. Who is allowed to speak? 2, how would you articulate the relationship between science and culture that the author speaks about? So just generally, like, how are we understanding the way that culture is impacting what even counts as science? And finally, how does the author challenge traditional models of scientific expertise? Then I would invite a group to participate in a deeper reflection. And here really what we want to do is be applying these concepts, these ideas that are presented in the work to our own research position. So we might ask questions such as, what histories of science in your own field bear examination? Are there histories that continue to be alive, even if not necessarily in say what may seem on the surface, your everyday practices? Are there foundations that bear examination? 2, what changes are we engaging in to reimagine science and engineering? Are there actively things that that are happening, that are shifting your field in a way that maybe feels more just, or addressing these histories? And 3, what are productive ways to interrogate this is a quote from the author, interrogate the historical and current inequities and ways STEM training has been and is deployed for incredible advances in human health and understanding, as well as for purposes of dispossession, because these two things are happening simultaneously. Are there ways to disentangle them? So as I said, if any of you are interested in having your own discussions, further discussion guides are available if you go on the FRI website, which I'll have up here in a moment. But first, I just kind of wanted to offer some closing provocations, that I hope you will take with you and let sit with you for a while. One is, I think we see in this piece, and we see through again a vast body of research beyond this example, that the histories of colonialism continue to impact science. And one of the ways we can see that is by thinking about asking ourselves the questions like, what are the costs of scientific discovery? Like, what are the acceptable costs? And for whom are they acceptable and why? I think that's, we may question, why are the same communities continually being asked to sacrifice, perhaps, as this can often be the case in many fields. And then a challenge to explore your own field's relationship to coloniality. I should add to do a lot of these exercises requires research and effort. We're all researchers, and we have the capacity to do this, to learn about the history of your field, to learn about the origins. They may not be the stories that are told in the textbooks. They are still there. So thank you all for attending. I do hope that you will continue to connect with us on our website. You can join our email list to continue to learn about these events, to sign up for future sessions. This is the first of a series that will be running through the fall quarter. Follow us on Twitter if you want to have a conversation around this. I've been using the hashtag asking different questions. And the last thing I do ask of you is this is a new project. This is a new experiment for us. It is also part of a research project. And we want to understand how we can do it better and what its impacts are. So I'm going to put up a short poll, just 3 questions, and it is anonymous, and I invite you all, if you'd like, to take part in the poll, which I am officially launching now. Yeah, just thank you all for joining us. Welcome feedback, welcome emails, further conversation, and hope that you all are able to make time to think about the role of colonialism, what role Indigenous science may have in your own intellectual conversations. So thank you.